Okay, we are going to begin chapter 24. Okay, so chapter 24 is an interesting chapter because it talks about why we sin. So, often we don't like to focus on the negative, and this chapter might seem as if we're focusing on the negative, but in actual fact, this chapter has a very important message and brings about a very important awareness. And as I always say, awareness is the precursor to choice. When we are aware of what the effects of our actions and attitudes and thought, speech, and action are, then we know whether we want to actually act on those desires or not. So when speaking, and we are really in the middle of a topic, which is the natural love that every Jew has for Hashem, which can be awakened. It's not a love that is produced. It's not even a tavuna, which we describe to be as a result of intellectual pursuit. So even though it wouldn't affect the emotions in a full-blown manner, but a tavuna is still an intellectual emotion, a conviction in the recesses of your heart, so it does affect you some way. We have been explaining since chapter 18 the concept of the natural love that every Jew has for Hashem, but it needs to be awakened. And we explained previously how this natural love that we inherit from our forefather Avraham Avinu, it comes from the same place as faith, as emunah. And how does this actually apply to and motivate us in doing the mitzvahs? When we realize that belief and denial of Hashem are expressed either by doing the 248 positive mitzvahs or transgressing the 365 negative commandments. So we can really connect the two, emunah and this natural love, because they come from the same level. And sometimes our emunah has to be awakened, and it's not, always in a revealed state, and this natural love as well. And we explained how even a Jew who is very apparently far from all things practically having to do with Yiddishkeit, meaning he is not a practicing Jew. He does not do the mitzvahs. He may not even know so much about the commandments. But when it becomes very clear to him that he has a choice whether or not to negate Hashem or die, every single Jew will be ready to die al Kiddush Hashem. And this is because both his emunah and natural love have been activated. And we're seeing in real time example after example after example from the hostages. So we don't even have to go back in history. I usually used to give examples, oh, this person and that person, but now we have it really in real time, how the spark of faith just shone so bright in a situation where there was clarity. Now, the previous chapter, chapter 23, explained how, yes, we confirm Hashem's existence through performing the mitzvahs, but we actually achieve unity and oneness with Hashem through doing the mitzvahs and studying Torah. And specifically, we mentioned Torah, how Torah is the will of Hashem, so there's nothing diluting the will of Hashem when we study Torah. And this chapter is going to explain the flip side, is going to explain how sinning causes separation from this unity and oneness with Hashem. And that awareness will hopefully bring us not to sin, will cause us to restrain ourselves from temptation and sinning. So what happens when a person actually sins? When a person sins, his animal soul, right? And not only his animal soul, but the expressions or the garments, we call them expressions because that's more understandable, but really in Tanya, the language used is the garments of the animal soul, which are thought, speech, and action. So the animal soul itself and the expressions of the animal soul which comes from a type of klipa known as klipas noiga, right? His animal soul and the expressions of it do not unite with Hashem at the time of his sinning, but they unite with klipa. Klipa is something which Hashem created, which conceals him. And remember that we have explained that Hashem created klipa with a very limited life force as a means to an end, for us to overcome klipa, for us to transform klipa into holiness, because klipa really conceals godliness. So klipa feels as if it has its own existence. Klipa feels separate from Hashem. And what happens when a person sins is something really interesting. What happens is that a person, by virtue of sinning, does not only connect with klipa, but descends even lower than klipa. Now, how can this even be, right? How does this work? So let's first explain when you do a mitzvah, which is not on this chapter, but in order to understand this, it's important to understand what happens with your soul when you do a mitzvah. So when you do a mitzvah while activating the godly soul, and the godly soul is using the body as an ally to perform the mitzvah, right? You are actually connecting with a level that is higher than your godly soul, because your godly soul comes from Hashem, whereas the mitzvahs are actually the will of Hashem, which is higher than the soul. So when a person does a mitzvah, they are elevating themselves to a place higher than their own godly soul. And now the same is true when a person sins. When a person sins, his animal soul and the expressions thereof are descending to a place that is even lower than klipa. But we can ask, what does that even mean? What's lower than klipa? Isn't klipa like the lowest? Like, doesn't it conceal Hashem? Like, what does that mean that we descend to a place even lower than klipa? So klipa itself, when it was created, was not in a physical body. It was created knowing Hashem and knowing its mission. Much like the Yetzer Hara has a mission to trip you up and is really happy when you don't get tripped up, but he's only performing his mission. Hashem sends him on a mission. So too Klipa, when it's created, knows Hashem and knows its mission. It cannot even completely deny Hashem because it knows what its life force is, Hashem, right? What it does do is deny Hashem's exclusivity, oneness. That's why it's called Elikim Acherim, other gods, meaning, oh yeah, sure, Hashem gave me life, but there are other things as well. And what happens is that the spark of godliness that is within the klipa is imprisoned within the klipa, making the klipa itself also feel like a god. So it doesn't deny Hashem, but it also feels like it's Hashem, another god, right? But what happens when the klipa goes into a body and causes a person to sin? The person who sins is not fulfilling a mission. The person who sins is going against Hashem's will, and therefore at the moment of sin is lower than the actual klipa, because he denies Hashem's unity even more than klipa itself. Now, if this is the case, why does a person sin? Like, if this was forefront in our minds constantly, we wouldn't have a desire to sin, right? And that's exactly the answer. The Alter Rebbe answers that a person sins because a spirit of folly enters into him, a ruach shtus. He sins because he is momentarily insane. So the example is actually a very interesting example that the Alter Rebbe brings. The example that the Alter Rebbe brings is that of an adulteress, right? Now, this same woman at another time would be willing to sacrifice her life for Hashem rather than negate Hashem's unity and oneness. But right now she is sinning. So you could think that she was carried away with passion, right? But the Gemara actually says that it's the reason she sins is because she is temporarily insane. It's because of insanity. Because if it would not be for this insanity, she would be able to control her passion. Why? This same woman would not negate Hashem's unity or oneness. This same woman wouldn't even make a show of idolatry and would rather die. The suffering that she would go through controlling her passion is less than dying. And therefore, it is only because a spirit of insanity entered into her that she commits the sin of adultery. Which is, if she wouldn't, she would go through much less suffering than if she were prepared to die to negate Hashem's oneness and unity. So what's very interesting about this Ruach Shtus, the spirit of folly, is that the Alter Rebbe tells us that this Ruach Shtus affects us in every aspect of our godly soul even, except for the level of Chachma, right? So the godly soul and the animal soul and every single creation in this entire universe is created through 10 attributes, 10 spheres, right? They all have, every creation has within it the 10 spheres, which is the way of Hashem's light and life coming into the creation. So even the animal soul and also the godly soul. But when the Ruach Shtus enters the person, the Ruach Shtus prevents the godly soul from prevailing. So the godly soul is imprisoned, has entered into this spirit of folly, except for the highest sphera, which is the sphera of Chachma. And this sphera of Chachma is where our emunah comes from. Even a little bit higher than Chachma, but there's a part of Chachma that it includes as well. And therefore, the person is able to die al Kiddush Hashem instead of negating Hashem, but on the other hand, is also able to sin in a way that if they would not sin, would cause them much less suffering than that. This spirit of folly also conceals the hidden love that we are talking about on the level of Chachma. Even though it doesn't affect your faith completely, but it conceals your hidden love, which makes things very unclear, right? We explained that when does a person do something very decisive? When things are very clear. So why is a person able to die al Kiddush Hashem instead of negating Hashem? Because it's very clear to him at that moment that negating Hashem is his existence, it would go contrary to his existence, right? So the Ruach Shtus, in this example of the adulteress, the spirit of folly, causes her to distinguish between adultery and idolatry, considering idolatry to be worse. She sort of makes this rationalization. Well, I'm not so bad because I'm not serving idols. I'm not committing idolatry. And we can also make this rationale. However, every sin, this is what this chapter is all about, every single sin, even a so-called minor sin, causes a person to be separated from Hashem's oneness and causes the person to descend even lower than Klippa itself. Because Klippa does not violate Hashem's will. Klippa knows its mission. And the person who sins, this is very interesting, becomes even lower than all the creations that come from Klippa. So which creations come from Klippa? Non-kosher animals, reptiles, basically everything that we are prohibited to use and consume. Their source is Klippa. But when we sin, we become even lower than those creations, which is why the Gemara says something extremely interesting, that when a person has temptation to sin, or when he actually sins, he should remember that he's even lower than a mosquito. Now, why a mosquito of all creations and creatures and creepy crawlies, right? Because very interesting about the nature of a mosquito. Did you know that a mosquito will bite you, will sting you, right, and suck your blood, but the mosquito does not excrete. It eventually dies, right, when it's consumed so much that then it just dies. So in other words, a mosquito takes but does not excrete, preferring death. He will continue. It's not like the mosquito is saying, well, I have no way of excreting what I'm consuming, so therefore I just won't consume. No, the mosquito goes, consumes, sucks your blood, and doesn't excrete and dies. And therefore, that's why the Gemara says when you sin, you're even worse than a mosquito. You're lower than a mosquito. So it's a little like scary, but we'll get to the end of the chapter and we'll realize that this is not the objective of the chapter to scare us, but to create an awareness. So animals and beasts don't violate Hashem's will. In fact, animals and beasts fear humans unless the human appears as an animal. And how do we know that? From the story of Daniel, the prophet Daniel in the lion's den. I'm sure all of you know the details, that he walked into the lion's den. The emperor would have thought he was like sending him to his death, and the lions were very docile, and they not only did they not attack him, but they subdued themselves to him, and they sat very calmly next to him because Daniel was a tzaddik. But a regular person who sins, an animal would not be scared of. But the real nature of an animal is to fear humans. So therefore, when a person sins, we're descending to a level even lower than an animal. Now, here's a question, because some sins do seem more grave than others. There does seem to be a hierarchy in sins, as in the example of a halacha, which is pikuach nefesh doichal Shabbos. So, for example, we know that saving a life supersedes keeping Shabbos. But the Alter Rebbe explains over here that it's not because saving a life is more important than Shabbos. It's because you save a person's life so that he will be able to keep Shabbos more times. In other words, if his life would not be saved, he wouldn't be able to keep any more Shabbos. But since we save his life, the future Shabbosim are more important than this one Shabbos. That's why we save his life. But still, it seems that way, that there is a hierarchy. The other example is, for example, if there are 3 mitzvahs that we know that are considered yaroig v'al yaver, or 3 sins, actually, not mitzvahs, which is idolatry, adultery, and murder. Right? That if someone were forced to commit these sins, it's preferable to die than to commit them. So yes, the answer is that there are different consequences for sins, but all sins weaken our bond with Hashem. So later on, and we've learned this in this class, in Ageres HaTshuva, we compared all 613 mitzvahs to the threads of a rope that connect us with Hashem. So every time you transgress a commandment, one thread gets weakened and another thread gets torn, and so the whole entire rope becomes weaker, right? So although there are different consequences, this is the will of Hashem, and the Alter Rebbe doesn't actually go into that explanation in this chapter. He says it's like Gzeiras HaKosov, it's what Hashem wanted. But all sins have in common that they weaken our bond with Hashem. So after sinning, what happens? The person's godly soul is able to rise. So not all is lost. You've sinned, you've gone down a level, even lower than Klippa, but your Nefesh Elokis is able to extract you out of this level of Klippa, and it is able to arise itself where it was in exile. And there is no greater exile for the neshama, which comes from a very, very high place, to go to a lower place, even lower than Avodah Zarah. And the example that the Alter Rebbe gives over here is like as if a person would grab the king's head and push it into filth, even for a moment. There is no greater gullus than that, even momentarily, which is what happens basically when we do a sin. So in other words, the differences between sins are only after sinning. But at the time of sinning, there is a severing of a connection with Hashem, which applies to all sins, even minor ones. So what's actually the purpose of this chapter, right? Is it to make us scared? Don't you sin because, you're descending into Klippa. Well, that there is a point to that. That is one point, but more than that, the point and the purpose of this chapter is that the Alter Rebbe wants us to feel the reality of our connection to Hashem, and so that sin becomes unthinkable. We develop an awareness so that we have an opportunity to choose. If we wouldn't know the realities of both sides, we wouldn't really have free choice. But here we are very, very aware of what happens, and this is an opportunity for us to take the higher road and not sin. And that is the purpose of this chapter. To remember, and the other thing that the Alter Rebbe just emphasizes in the end of the chapter is to remember that, yes, you can extract yourself from sinning, which causes a disconnection from Hashem. But we also have to remember that performing a mitzvah is eternal. So the connection that you establish with Hashem, which is higher than your own neshama as a result of doing a mitzvah, that can never be taken away from you. So, in other words, it's not really like a linear thing, like you are connected, you're not connected, you are connected, you're not connected, right? We are very complex human beings. Sometimes we sin, sometimes we do a mitzvah, sometimes we sin, sometimes we do a mitzvah. The objective is to get us to sin less and to do mitzvahs more, to achieve that eternal connection which can never be taken away from us, and to avoid the state of being which is a weakening of a connection with Hashem. So the purpose of this chapter is really to know the opposite and to achieve the opposite of what is written in this chapter. Okay, any questions? Yes, hi Sarah. I love Sina's like facial expressions, yeah.
I just have one question. Is that like you keep saying that a sin is when the spirit of shtus comes into you, right?
Yeah.
So that seems like an unconscious thing. And you're
Which
saying
we're
that
bringing to the front of our
consciousness.
consciousness. Yeah.
So you're saying that the more we learn and the more we understand what happens to us, the less likely we are to succumb to the shtus.
Absolutely. It's to bring
Okay.
awareness.
Okay.
Absolutely. Because it's insane for a person to go against their very life force. Like, why would they want to do that? Right? Or to, just as we would never negate Hashem when we are forced to negate the existence of Hashem, every sin is a negation of Hashem. It's saying,
Mm-hmm.
I exist, not Hashem. Or I exist and Hashem exists, but not exclusively. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is really the negation of the unity of Hashem, the oneness of Hashem. Sina, were you going to say something? No. Okay. Anyone else?
Just gonna have to read the notes.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Read the notes of the previous classes as well. We don't want to leave you just with this like
I know.
sinning chapter.
No, maybe the last.
Yeah, so the next chapter goes back to the flip side and the positives of doing a mitzvah. So, yeah. Okay, everybody, have
Thank
a
you.
great week. Yeah, you're welcome.
Bye,
Have a great day. Have a great week.
Thank you, Hannah.